Welcome to an Odyssey in Mixology. This is the first part of my segment on using ginger in cocktails, and in this video, I'm making 6 different versions of the Penicillin cocktail with each using a different form of ginger. Let's see which one is best. I hope you enjoy. Ginger has a powerful flavor that encompasses root-like earthy flavors as well as more dominant, kind of bright, almost spicy characteristics. Considering how interesting a flavor it is and the number of ginger liqueurs on the market, you'd think there'd be a ton of common ginger cocktails. Sure, Moscow mules are usually made with ginger beer, but I'm talking about drinks with a pure ginger flavor. Now with that being said, there's really only a single cocktail that instantly comes to mind when you think ginger and mixology. This is a ginger-forward cocktail called the Penicillin. It's actually a fairly new creation, but it's already become a modern classic. It was created by Sam Ross when he worked at New York's famous Milk and Honey bar in 2005. It quickly traveled the globe and became one of the most famous cocktails of the last 20 years. There are a lot of variations of it now, but the basic recipe of Sam's Penicillin cocktail is 2 ounces of blended scotch, 3/4 ounces of lemon juice, 3/4 ounces of a honey ginger syrup, and then finally 1/4 ounce of an Islay scotch floated on top. The homemade honey ginger syrup is a staple of this drink, but there's a lot of different ways to add ginger to a cocktail, and the Penicillin is a very good drink to try them all out in. Homemade ginger honey syrup is where the Penicillin started, but it's also a really great addition to a lot of other drinks. Store-bought versions of a ginger honey syrup are somewhat common, and they require less effort than the homemade version. Pure ginger syrups are less like simple and honey syrups because they provide a much more condensed ginger flavoring. Fresh ginger, when sliced and muddled, can bring a brighter ginger sharpness to a drink that might be more muted in some of the other versions. Ginger bitters are a little less common, but they're easy to add and they don't increase a drink's sugar content. There are also a surprisingly high number of ginger liqueurs on the market, many of which I'll be comparing in part 4 of this segment. Obviously, there are pros and cons to each, and they do require slight tweaks to work in a similar cocktail, but once you know how they interact in that drink, they can then be applied to other cocktails as well. Now the next thing to do is to make the baseline Penicillin. Now when I make a Penicillin, I like to modify the original recipe ever so slightly. The main change is that I use a budget peated Islay scotch as the base, rather than a blended scotch as the original recipe calls for. I love smoky and peated spirits, so this creates a smokier cocktail that might have a bit less mass appeal, but it's more enjoyable to me. I think the brightness and spiciness from the ginger is also balanced a bit better by the Islay's peated notes, but regardless, I still default to the homemade ginger honey syrup. Now luckily, this is really easy to make, so I always carry some on hand. To make a honey ginger syrup, you first need fresh ginger. It's best to peel a 5 to 6 inch section and then cut it into thin slices so that there's more surface area to contact the liquid. Once that's done, I add 1 cup of honey and 1 cup of water in no particular order and all of my thin slices of ginger to a pan. Next, I'm going to put the burner on a medium heat and stir until the mixture comes to a boil. Once it gets there, it's best to turn the heat down to low and let it simmer for 5 to 10 minutes. Sometimes I'll use my muddler to compress the ginger slices just so I can be sure I'm extracting all of the ginger flavor from them. Regardless, the important thing is to stir continuously. Straining the mixture is easy, and I've been able to get it to last in the fridge for a few months before spoiling by using some wine preservation methods. Vacuum stoppers work well, but I found that argon gas canisters works even better. Once the syrup is done, the rest of the drink is very straightforward too. Now, in my opinion, the Penicillin cocktail is one of the best smelling drinks of all time. And this drink, regardless of whether you're making the regular or my version, is marked by heavy peated smoke and a bright, almost kind of sickly sweet ginger and honey forwardness. Now, in the original recipe, the blended scotch is the primary spirit, but the Islay scotch is floated on top, so you still get those peated smoke smells. So taste-wise, the aroma carries over in the flavor almost entirely. The sickly sweet notes are replaced by more of an earthy ginger heat that ties in really nicely with the honey and the acid. Now, the honey doesn't fully cancel out the sourness, but it rounds it out enough that this is an incredibly well-balanced cocktail. It is a bit sharp from the ginger spice, that really just means it's fresh, but the lemon juice still leaves that tartness, which is really refreshing and crisp in this cocktail. And in my opinion, the extra smoky notes for making this with a pure Islay scotch rather than the blended and the Islay scotch mix just rounds this out even nicer. It gives it kind of a darker note, which I really enjoy. Cocktails with fewer ingredients usually have better balance and lower complexity. The same could be said about the original Penicillin or my smokier variant. Both are simple and perfect. Penicillin is a modern classic for many reasons, and whilst I enjoy the smokier version just a little bit more, it's just one of the many variants that will continue to pop up over the coming years. Regardless though, the original recipe will be the one that sticks around no matter what. Now again, switching the blended scotch out for the Islay scotch is purely my personal preference, but this video is still valid if you choose to keep the original recipe. Regardless, let's take a closer look at the different versions of ginger and see how they change my baseline recipe. This store-bought honey ginger syrup from Barsmith is a direct replacement for my homemade syrup. Because of that, it'll be the easiest to compare against the baseline cocktail. It comes in at $6 and will make about 20 drinks from this 375 milliliter bottle. Next up is a store-bought pure ginger syrup from Lieber & Company. Lieber & Company have a good reputation of making high-quality fruit syrups and sweeteners. Of the 6 I've tried from them, their fiery ginger bottle has been my favorite by a long shot. The ginger flavor here is highly condensed, even though it is a little sweet, it isn't a sugar or honey-based syrup like the previous two. At $13 for this bottle, you can get around 19 cocktails out of it. For this version, I'm going to add half an ounce to my shaker and then replace the honey ginger syrup with a 1/4 ounce of a regular honey syrup. Raw ginger is a bit brighter and spicier than infused or boiled ginger. It's been widely accepted to have healing properties, and fun fact, that's partly why the Penicillin cocktail has its name. For this version of the cocktail, I'm going to cut a 1/4 inch thick piece and muddle it in my shaker. Next, I'm going to add 3/4 of an ounce of a non-ginger honey syrup. Ginger bitters, like those from Infuse, are usually used to add a ginger twist in the background of a cocktail rather than be the drink's primary flavor. That being said, they're still strong enough to hold their own against the other versions of ginger. This bottle costs around $18 and you can get around 200 dashes from it. I'm going to add 3 dashes, and this recipe will also use 3/4 of an ounce of the non-ginger honey syrup. For the final version, there are plenty of ginger liqueurs to choose from, and that makes it a bit difficult to figure out which one you should buy. So in the last part of the segment, I'll be comparing all of these to figure out which is the best and why. Of all of these, I'm going to pick Domaine de Canton because from a price standpoint, it's in the middle of this larger group. It's also the most common ginger liqueur associated with a quality taste. I'm going to add 3/4 of an ounce of liqueur, and because it's a bit sweet, I'll reduce the non-ginger honey syrup from the baseline 3/4 of an ounce to half an ounce. The Islay Scotch is also going to reduce by half an ounce so that the drink's alcohol content is in line with the others. Alright, so here are my 6 different Penicillin cocktails with the full recipes listed above. As with my last comparison video, I'm going to quickly try each and then circle back around to try each one in a bit more detail. So immediately you can tell that the honey on that one is a lot less full than the homemade version. That one's really nice. That was really nice, actually. Okay, the fresh ginger version. That one's pretty spicy. And the bitters. That's good. That's better than I thought it would be. And the liqueur is, I think, the most different out of all, but still really nice. Now, immediately, there isn't a terrible one in this lineup. That just kind of goes to show you that ginger is such a powerful flavor, even that when you try to recreate it in so many different ways, you still get a good ginger flavor out of it. So now that I've done my quick run through, I'm going to go back around and talk about each of these in a bit more detail, because there definitely are some that stand out more than the others. I've already gone through the first version that uses the homemade honey ginger syrup, so I'm going to jump immediately to the second one using the store-bought version of it. So this one isn't bad by any means. It does a decent job of bringing both the ginger and the honey flavors forward, but both are significantly muted when compared to the homemade version. The main thing that's standing out on this one is that whilst there is a ginger flavor there, all of the bite and heat is missing. Fresh ginger is almost spicy, and a lot of that is still present in the homemade ginger syrup, and it's actually present in most of these as well. But here it's missing, and that hurts this drink. It makes it a bit candy-ish, quite a bit more flat than the other ones, and whilst it is refreshing, it's refreshing because there's a lot less going on in it. Now you can bump up the syrup in this one by an extra 1/4 ounce or even maybe a 1/2 ounce, and you will get more flavor out of it, but you're also going to bring the sugar as well, and that's going to change this from a kind of a tart drink into a much more sweet drink. It's not what I'm looking for in a Penicillin, and because this is a direct comparison to the baseline recipe, this one does fall flat, but you do put less effort into creating the drink. So this is the other store-bought syrup, but it's a different type of syrup, so there is going to be a fairly big difference here. So the Lieber & Company syrup is called Fiery Ginger, and unlike the last version, that spiciness is very much still here. Now, the ginger tastes natural and the syrup is thick, so that texture of the cocktail is similar, even though the honey syrup is reduced. At this point, I don't think it's necessarily better or worse than the baseline version, but it is a little bit different, and it's different because that ginger is more full. But using this for other cocktails, I think is where this one shines, because whilst you can use this in just penicillins, the ability to bring a natural, full, and spicy ginger flavor into a variety of drinks is where something like this doesn't excel, because this one you're bringing the honey with it as well. So this is really good, and for a store-bought version, I think they did a fantastic job in making this syrup. So for most cocktails, my default is using fresh and preferably raw ingredients. For the Penicillin, I always go for the homemade syrup instead, so crushing up raw ginger is a little bit new for me. Now, because I'm still using fresh ginger in the homemade syrup, technically the ingredient list for both of these is exactly the same. The one difference is that the ginger here is directly infused into the drink, whereas for the other one, it's boiled into the syrup itself. So as far as how that changes the flavor, honestly, not so much. This one, I think, is probably a bit spicier than the other one. I think the boiling might reduce some of that spice. That being said, this one is really tart, it's really bright, it's fresh, it's nice, it's exactly what I'm looking for in a penicillin cocktail. I can tell the difference between these two with having them side by side, but if I received this and someone told me this was using a ginger honey syrup, I'd probably believe them right off. So these are very similar. So the bitters version. So it's hard to remain completely unbiased in these videos, and to be totally honest, I thought the bitters version and the store-bought honey ginger syrup would be the lowest of the group. Now, I think that probably is still correct on paper, but the reason I like this one, and it's kind of surprising to me, is that this is the darkest of the group here. Now, the ginger flavor itself is a bit weaker, and it tastes kind of a bit old and dusty. However, the heat and the bite is there. Now, the bitterness from the bitters, you would have thought, is muting a lot of that ginger's kind of natural brightness. And I think whether or not that's a good thing is a bit subjective. So I tend to enjoy darker drinks, and this actually doesn't bother me. And the oldness and dustiness kind of works with the Islay Scotch a bit more than I expected it to. The darker, bitter flavors would have me kind of reaching to this one maybe a bit more than is traditionally acceptable based on the classic recipes and the popular recipes in front of me. So again, a little bit subjective, but I actually really like this one. And finally, the liqueur. So this one does not follow the original recipe. However, if you look up the penicillin on websites like Difford Sky or even on bar menus, quite often you'll see them using this liqueur in place of the honey ginger syrup, just because this is a bit easier to get out in front of a bar. So the final version using ginger liqueur is kind of a mix of all of these. So this is a crisp and refreshing drink. The spice from the ginger is there. It's very forward, and that reminds me of the fresh ginger version. The ginger flavor itself doesn't taste perfectly natural. It does lack some of the heightened flavors that we see on kind of the Liebherr & Company syrups. It's quite a bit better than the store-bought version, but it's not as rounded as the homemade syrup version. And that's kind of the nice thing about this comparison, because each one is a little bit different than the one before it. Now, overall, these are really good, and there isn't one that I dislike. Now, the main criteria for judging this is which one is the best penicillin, and that means which one nails the flavors in the original baseline recipe the best. In last place, I'm putting the version using the store-bought honey ginger syrup. The flavors in this syrup are weak compared to the sweetness level, and it's a bit artificial tasting. Regardless, it's still not bad. It's cheap, and it's easy to use in simple cocktails. In fifth place, I'm putting the ginger bitters version. It's worth noting that even though this is second from last, it still gets an A rating. The dustiness and darkness of this penicillin isn't for everyone, but I happen to really like it. If I wasn't trying so hard to be unbiased, then I'd probably bump this up a spot or two. In fourth place, I'm putting the ginger liqueur variant. This is a very refreshing cocktail, but it's different from the baseline recipe. The scotch is less pronounced, and the ginger is a bit thin. It's still a great drink though. I'm giving third place to the fresh ginger version. This is the spiciest penicillin, and it retains the balance between the ingredients that makes the baseline version so good. Whilst the baseline is smoothed out though, this one is a bit rough around the edges because the ginger is just a bit too sharp. Second place goes to the Liebherr & Company Fiery Ginger Syrup. This is an explosion of natural and not overly sweet ginger flavoring. Because of how potent and full the ginger flavor is, it does throw off the balance a bit compared to the baseline. That balance isn't sorely missed though. The enhanced ginger fullness makes this a better tasting penicillin if you want the heightened flavors. From that standpoint, this is an incredible ingredient and a really awesome drink. That means that first place goes to the baseline version using the homemade honey ginger syrup. The reason this wins is mostly due to the balance between the ingredients. The liqueur version is more refreshing, the raw ginger version is spicier, the Liebherr & Company version is more ginger forward, the bitters version is darker, and the store-bought syrup version is easier. The baseline is a classic combination though. A classic cocktail doesn't necessarily mean one with the most flavor. It means one that has no faults. Each ingredient in this baseline is utilized to its maximum effectiveness, and they all work together perfectly. Nothing stands out as too much, and there's no high expense needed to make it. It's just one of the few perfect cocktails that really can't be improved without sacrificing the low effort, low cost, or the simplicity in its full and balanced flavors. That's it for my video on comparing different ways to add ginger to a penicillin cocktail. In my next video, I'm going to make 3 medium complexity ginger-based cocktails that are really different from what I went through here, but absolutely worth making. If you enjoyed this video, then please like and subscribe, and thank you for watching. Cheers!